The sound of my heart monitor flatlined for 12 seconds. 12 seconds where Rebecca wasn't holding my hand because she wasn't there. She was 3 floors down in the hospital parking garage, kissing Marcus Williams while surgeons fought. To restart my heart. I know this because the security footage timestamp matched exactly when my pulse disappeared from the screen. Tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you. Make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Here's what she didn't know. I had seen the text message 3 days before my surgery, the one where Marcus wrote, "Once David's out of the picture, we can finally be together." Rebecca's response? "Just a few more days, baby. Surgery's risky anyway." They thought I was unconscious when the anesthesia wore off early. They thought I couldn't hear Rebecca whispering to Marcus on the phone outside my ICU room. The doctor said there might be complications. Maybe this is our chance. They thought I was too weak to fight back, too dependent to leave, too broken to rebuild. They were wrong about everything. The morning of my surgery began like any other Wednesday in Portland, with Rebecca rushing around our Beaverton home, coffee mug in hand, checking her phone every 30 seconds. She kissed my cheek with the same mechanical affection she'd shown for months. Lipstick leaving a mark I didn't bother to wipe away. "I'll be there when you wake up," she promised, adjusting her blazer in the hallway mirror. Dr. Moore said the surgery should take about 4 hours. "I'll just run a few errands while I wait." I nodded from the kitchen table, picking at my last meal before the procedure. The cardiac surgery had been scheduled for weeks and necessary. Intervention after my heart attack 6 months earlier had revealed severe blockages. At 42, I was too young for this, the doctors said. Too young and too stressed. Rebecca blamed my architecture firm, Chen & Associates, claiming the long hours and demanding clients had pushed me to this point. What she didn't mention was that my stress levels had skyrocketed right around the time she started working late, taking weekend business trips and receiving mysterious phone calls that made her smile in ways I hadn't seen in years. "David, you're being paranoid," she'd say, whenever I questioned the changes. "I'm building my career at Portland Marketing Solutions. This promotion could change everything for us." She was right about one thing: it did change everything. The drive to St. Mary's Medical Center was quiet. Rebecca's fingers drummed against the steering wheel as she navigated the morning traffic, her phone buzzing constantly with notifications. She pretended not to notice. I stared out the passenger window at the familiar Portland skyline, counting the buildings I'd helped design over the past 15 years. The Morrison Tower, the Pearl District, mixed-use complex, the new library branch in Southeast Portland. Each structure represented years of my life, pieces of my soul embedded in steel and concrete. "Are you nervous?" Rebecca asked, though. Her tone suggested she was asking out of obligation rather than genuine concern. "A little," I admitted. "It's major surgery, Becca. There are always risks." She squeezed my hand briefly before returning it to the steering wheel. "Dr. Patterson is the best cardiac surgeon in Oregon. You'll be fine. We'll be fine." The word we hung in the air like a question mark I was afraid to examine too closely. St. Mary's Medical Center rose before us like a beacon of hope and terror combined. The 11-story building housed some of the Pacific Northwest's most advanced medical technology, and more importantly, it employed Dr. Alina Rodriguez, though I didn't know her name yet. I wouldn't learn about Alina until later, when her gentle hands and fierce advocacy would become the unexpected foundation of my recovery. Check-in was a blur of paperwork, insurance cards, and nervous small talk with other families in the waiting area. Rebecca sat beside me, scrolling through her phone with the intensity of someone conducting international business negotiations. Every few minutes, she'd excuse herself to take a call, returning with flushed cheeks and barely contained excitement that she attributed to work emergencies. "Mrs. Chen." A nurse appeared with a clipboard, her scrubs decorated with tiny hearts that seemed almost cruelly appropriate. "We're ready to take David up for pre-op." Rebecca stood quickly, perhaps too quickly, and gathered her purse with the efficiency of someone eager to begin their real day. She kissed my forehead. As I was transferred to a wheelchair, her lips cool against my skin. "I love you," she said, the words automatic and hollow. "I'll see you when you wake up." Those would be the last words my wife spoke to me as my wife. The preoperative area was a maze of curtained sections where patients waited in varying states of anxiety and resignation. I was assigned to Bay 7, where a cheerful nurse named Margaret helped me change into a hospital gown and began the process of preparing my body for surgery. IVs were inserted, blood was drawn, and consent forms were signed with hands that trembled slightly despite my attempts at calm. Dr. Patterson appeared around 9:30, his confident demeanor and silver hair inspiring the kind of trust that had built his reputation. He explained the procedure one final time, a quadruple bypass that would reroute blood flow around my blocked arteries, giving my heart a chance to heal and function properly again. The surgery typically takes 4 to 6 hours, he said, making notes on my chart. Recovery will be gradual, but with proper rehabilitation, you should be back to normal activities within 3 months. I wondered if that included rebuilding a marriage that felt increasingly like a house with a cracked foundation, or if normal meant something entirely different than what I'd known before. Rebecca returned just as they were wheeling me toward the operating room, her arrival timed perfectly to avoid too much waiting around. She walked alongside my gurney, her heels clicking against the polished floor, one hand resting on the rail in a gesture that photographers might have captured as devotion, but felt more like performance. "I'll be right here," she repeated as we reached the double doors that led to the surgical suite. "I'm not going anywhere." The anesthesiologist, a soft-spoken woman with kind eyes, placed a mask over my face and told me to count backward from 10. I made it to 7 before the world dissolved into comfortable darkness, carrying with it the image of Rebecca's face, beautiful, familiar, and somehow already distant, as if I were seeing her through glass that was slowly fogging over. What? I learned later, pieced together from security footage, witness accounts, and Rebecca's own careless admission, was that she waited exactly 43 minutes after my surgery began before leaving the hospital. 43 minutes to establish her presence, to be seen by the nursing staff, to create the appearance of a devoted wife maintaining vigil. The parking garage security camera caught her at 11:47 a.m., walking quickly toward a silver BMW that wasn't ours. Marcus Williams stepped out of the driver's seat, his expensive suit and confident smile suggesting a man accustomed to getting what he wanted. He was tall, athletic, everything that 8 years of marriage and increasing stress had prevented me from being. They embraced with the passion of lovers, reunited after a long separation. Though their separation had been merely the few hours since Rebecca left our house that morning, they drove to the Heathman Hotel downtown, where Marcus had reserved a suite with a view of the Willamette River. The same river I could see from my office window. The same view that had inspired some of my best architectural work. I ordered room service champagne and celebrated what Marcus later called the beginning of our real life together. Meanwhile, 3 floors above their celebration, my heart stopped. It happened during the most delicate part of the surgery, when Dr. Patterson was connecting the 3rd bypass graft. My heart, already weakened and traumatized, decided it had endured enough. The monitors erupted in chaos, alarms blaring as my pulse flatlined for 12 eternal seconds. Dr. Patterson later described it as a minor setback. Not uncommon in procedures of this complexity, the surgical team responded with practiced efficiency, administering medications and electrical shocks that convinced my heart to resume its rhythm. To them, it was a moment of professional challenge overcome. To me, lying unconscious on the table, it was something else entirely, a preview of mortality that would reshape everything about how I viewed my life and the people in it. Rebecca never knew about those 12 seconds. She was too busy toasting to my absence with the man who had been systematically destroying my marriage for the better part of a year. They returned to the hospital at 4:30 p.m., just as Dr. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Patterson was emerging from surgery to deliver his successful outcome report to the family. Everything went perfectly, he told Rebecca, who accepted the news with relief that seemed genuine enough to fool everyone except the part of me that was beginning to surface from anesthesia with unusual clarity. There was one small complication mid-procedure, but we handled it without issue. David should make a full recovery. Rebecca's relief wasn't for my survival, it was for the timing. Marcus stood behind her in the surgical waiting room, close enough to offer support, but far enough away to maintain plausible deniability. They had calculated everything perfectly, except for one detail they couldn't have anticipated. My brain's unusual reaction to the anesthesia that left me conscious and aware much earlier than expected. I heard everything. Rebecca whispering to Marcus outside my ICU room about how convenient it would have been if the complications had been more serious. Marcus suggesting they should be patient for just a little longer while I recovered enough to handle divorce proceedings. Rebecca wondering aloud if she should play the devoted wife for a few more weeks, or if my near-death experience gave her enough cover to ask for space. They spoke about my life, my potential death, and their future, together with the casual indifference of people discussing restaurant reservations. I was a problem to be solved, an obstacle to be managed, a person whose value had been reduced to the inconvenience my continued existence posed to their happiness. But they made one crucial mistake in their calculations. They assumed that surviving major surgery would leave me grateful, dependent, and malleable. They thought that facing mortality would make me cling more desperately to the familiar, even if the familiar was slowly poisoning me. Instead, those 12 seconds of flatlined existence had shown me something profound. I had been dying long before my heart stopped. I had been dying in a marriage where love had been replaced by routine, where partnership had been replaced by performance, where my wife saw me as a supporting character in her story, rather than the protagonist of my own. The revelation didn't come with anger, at least not initially. It came with clarity that was almost surgical in its precision. Rebecca didn't love me anymore, and perhaps more importantly, I wasn't sure I loved the person she had become. Woman I married 8 years ago had been ambitious, but also warm, supportive, and genuinely excited about building a life together. The woman sitting beside my hospital bed, checking her phone every few minutes and counting the hours until visiting time ended, was a stranger wearing my wife's face. Dr. Elena Rodriguez entered my recovery trajectory on day 3, though I didn't learn her name immediately. She was the cardiac rehabilitation specialist assigned to my case, a woman whose professional competence was matched only by her uncommon ability to see patients as whole human beings rather than collections of symptoms to be managed. Elena was beautiful in an understated way that had nothing to do with artifice and everything to do with genuine warmth. Her dark hair was usually pulled back in a practical ponytail, and her scrubs were plain navy blue. But when she smiled, which she did often, her entire face lit up with the kind of joy that reminded such things still existed in the world. "Good morning, David," she said on that first day, consulting her tablet, while perching on the edge of my bed with the casual confidence of someone accustomed to being welcomed. "I'm Elena Rodriguez, and I'm going to be working with you on your recovery. How are you feeling today?" It was such a simple question, but the way she asked it with genuine interest and patience for a real answer caught me off guard. Rebecca's daily inquiries about my condition were perfunctory, designed to gather information she could relay to others rather than understand my actual experience. Confused? Mostly? I answered honestly. "Everything feels different." Elena nodded as if confusion were the most reasonable response to major surgery, which it probably was. "Different how? Physically? Emotionally? Both?" "Both," I said, surprised by my own honesty. "It's like I'm seeing everything through new eyes." "That's more common than you might think," she said, making notes on her tablet. "Major cardiac events often trigger what we call post-surgery clarity. Your brain has been through significant trauma, your body is healing, and your perspective on life naturally shifts. Some patients find it unsettling, and others?" Elena smiled, and I felt something in my chest that had nothing to do with my healing heart. "Others find it liberating." That afternoon, Rebecca arrived with flowers and a forced cheerfulness that felt like a costume she was wearing for my benefit. She had brought my laptop, thinking I might want to review projects from the office. But Elena intercepted the suggestion with professional authority. "No work for at least 2 weeks," she said firmly. "David's brain needs rest as much as his heart does. Stress is one of the primary factors that led to his condition, and we're not going to repeat those patterns during recovery. Rebecca's smile tightened almost imperceptibly. Of course, but David is very dedicated to his work. He might feel anxious without some connection to the office. Alina looked at me with raised eyebrows, as if Rebecca had suggested something ridiculous. Deva, do you feel anxious about being disconnected from work right now? There's another simple question with a complex answer. Work had been my escape from an increasingly uncomfortable home life. The office had become a refuge where I could create beautiful things and feel accomplished, where my value wasn't questioned and my contributions were appreciated. But sitting in that hospital bed, with Elena's calm presence anchoring me to the moment, work felt like something that belonged to a different person's life. No, I said, meeting Rebecca's surprised gaze. I don't feel anxious about it at all. Elena's smile widened. Excellent. Recovery is about rediscovering what actually matters to you, not maintaining old patterns that weren't serving your health. Rebecca left earlier than usual that day, claiming a work emergency that required her immediate attention. I watched her hurry down the hospital corridor with the same urgency she'd shown leaving for her errands the morning of my surgery. And for the first time, I felt relief rather than abandonment when she disappeared from view. Alina returned an hour later with a wheelchair and a mischievous expression. Ready for your first adventure? Adventure? I looked down at my hospital gown and the various tubes still attached to my body. I'm not exactly dressed for excitement. Trust me, she said, positioning the wheelchair beside my bed with practiced efficiency. Sometimes the best adventures happen in hospital gowns. She wheeled me to an elevator I hadn't known existed, pressing a button marked R that I assumed stood for roof. When the doors opened, I understood why she had seemed so pleased with herself. The hospital's rooftop garden was a hidden oasis in the middle of urban Portland, complete with benches, walking paths, and a view of Mount Hood that took what little breath I had completely away. How did you know I'd like this? I asked as she parked my wheelchair beside a bench where she could sit and we could talk without the clinical distance of a hospital room. Alina settled beside me, pulling a thermos of coffee from her bag. You're an architect, right? I figured someone who designs buildings would appreciate good design in unexpected places. Plus, you've been staring out your window at the sky like a prisoner planning an escape. Her observation was so accurate it made me laugh, which hurt my chest, but felt worth the discomfort. I design buildings, but I haven't felt much like an architect lately. What do you feel like? Another Alina question that required honesty I wasn't sure I was ready to give. But sitting in that garden, with the afternoon sun warming my face, and the city spread out below us, I found myself telling her things I hadn't admitted to anyone, including myself. I told her about the growing distance in my marriage, the way conversations with Rebecca had become strategic exchanges of information rather than genuine communication. I told her about the long hours I'd been working, not because projects demanded it, but because home had stopped feeling like a sanctuary. I told her about the chest pains I'd been ignoring for months, the way stress had become such a constant companion that I'd forgotten what relaxation felt like. Alina listened without judgment, asking clarifying questions that helped me understand my own thoughts better than I had in years. She didn't offer advice or solutions, just presence and attention that felt like the most generous gift anyone had given me in months. Recovery isn't just about healing your heart, she said as we watched the sun begin to set behind the West Hills. It's about figuring out what kind of life you want your heart to beat for. That evening, Rebecca called to say she wouldn't be able to visit. Another work emergency, another crisis that required her immediate attention. I told her I understood. And for the first time in our marriage, I meant it completely. I understood that she was building a life that didn't include me, making choices that prioritized her happiness over our partnership, creating distance that she hoped would eventually justify the ending she'd already decided on. I also understood that I was surprisingly okay with it. Alina stopped by during her evening rounds, finding me staring out my window at the city lights below. She didn't say anything, just sat in the chair Rebecca had abandoned and shared the comfortable silence that seemed to be her specialty. How long have you been married? She asked eventually. 8 years, I said, though it feels like much longer. Good longer or bad longer? Complicated longer, I said, which made her laugh. That's the most honest answer about marriage I've heard in years, she said. Most people either idealize it or demonize it. Complicated longer sounds much more real. We talked until her shift ended about marriage and career and the strange way life sometimes forces you to reevaluate everything you thought you knew about yourself. Lena mentioned that she'd been divorced for 2 years, that her ex-husband had been a surgeon who valued his career more than their relationship, and that she'd learned to appreciate the freedom of designing her own happiness rather than compromising it for someone else's vision. "Don't get me wrong," she said as she prepared to leave. "I believe in love, in partnership, in building something beautiful with another person. But it has to be mutual. It has to be chosen every day by both people, not just endured by one while the other explores their options." After she left, I lay in my hospital bed thinking about choice and commitment and the difference between holding on and holding together. Rebecca was making choices that excluded me, creating a future where I was either absent or irrelevant. Alina was making choices that included me, at least professionally, helping me heal and recover and rediscover parts of myself I'd forgotten existed. The contrast was stark and undeniable, and it filled me with something I hadn't felt in months. Excitement about what came next. Tomorrow would bring new conversations with Alina, new steps in my recovery. New discoveries about who I was becoming in the aftermath of everything I'd lost. Tomorrow would also bring Rebecca, with her forced cheerfulness and careful questions and barely concealed impatience for my recovery to progress quickly enough to suit her timeline. But tonight, for the first time since my heart attack, I fell asleep, feeling hopeful about my future. Not the future I'd planned with Rebecca, but the future I was beginning to imagine for myself. The future where my heart would beat for things and people who valued its rhythm, where my life would be shaped by authentic connections rather than obligated performances. Alina was right. Recovery wasn't just about healing my heart. It was about figuring out what kind of life I wanted my heart to beat for. As I drifted off to sleep in that hospital bed, I was beginning to get some very interesting ideas about what that life might look like. The foundation of my marriage to Rebecca had been built on a lie I'd told myself for so long that I'd almost believed it was true. We met during my final year at Portland State University's architecture program, and she was finishing her business degree, and I was designing my thesis project, Community Center, that would eventually be built in Southeast Portland. Real contribution to the city's skyline. Rebecca had been everything I thought I wanted in a partner. Ambitious, beautiful, socially confident in ways that complemented my more introspective nature. She could work a room at networking events, while I stood in corners, observing the way people moved through spaces and wondering how better design might improve their interactions. She was the marketing mind that could sell my architectural visions to clients, who saw buildings as investments rather than art. Our courtship had been a carefully choreographed dance of mutual benefit. Rebecca helped me present my work more effectively, coaching me through client presentations and teaching me the language of business that architecture school had neglected to include in its curriculum. I helped her understand the creative process, the way inspiration could strike at unexpected moments and demand immediate attention. The satisfaction of solving complex spatial problems through elegant design. We married 2 years after graduation, in a ceremony that Rebecca planned with the same meticulous attention to detail she brought to her marketing campaigns. Every element was perfectly coordinated. From the flowers to the music to the photographer who captured images that would look impressive in frames for years to come. Looking back, I realized that our wedding had been Rebecca's first major production, a preview of the kind of curated life she wanted to create. The early years of our marriage had been productive and comfortable. We bought the house in Beaverton, a solid investment in a neighborhood with good schools and appreciating property values. Rebecca's career at Portland Marketing Solutions advanced steadily, while I built Chen & Associates from a one-person firm operating out of our spare bedroom to a respected practice with 6 employees and projects throughout the Pacific Northwest. We had talked about children in the abstract way that young couples discuss future possibilities someday, when we were more established, and finances were more secure, when we had checked enough boxes on our respective career advancement lists. Someday became a moving target that receded as we achieved each milestone we'd thought would prepare us for parenthood. The turning point had been subtle, occurring over months rather than in a single dramatic moment. Rebecca's promotion to senior account manager brought longer hours, more travel, and exposure to a level of corporate culture that prioritized networking and relationship building over the simple satisfaction of work well done. She began attending evening events that I wasn't invited to, weekend retreats for high-potential employees, and conferences in cities that seemed suspiciously romantic for business gatherings. Marcus Williams had entered our lives as a client, then a friend, then something more complicated that Rebecca insisted was still friendship even as their interactions took on undertones that made me increasingly uncomfortable. He was everything that 8 years of building a business and managing stress had prevented me from being spontaneous, financially reckless in the way that only truly wealthy people could afford to be, willing to drop everything for impromptu adventures that Rebecca found irresistible. Marcus owned a chain of upscale restaurants throughout the Pacific Northwest. It's the kind of establishments that charged $30 for entrees and attracted customers who valued ambience over substance. He had hired Portland Marketing Solutions to develop a new brand strategy, specifically requesting Rebecca's team based on recommendations from mutual contacts in the city's business community. I had been happy for Rebecca's professional success, proud that her expertise was being recognized by prominent clients. Marcus seemed charming enough during our few social interactions, though something about his easy confidence and casual displays of wealth made me feel protective of Rebecca in ways I couldn't quite articulate. The first red flag had been Rebecca's enthusiasm for working late on the Marcus account, staying at the office until 9 or 10 at night to collaborate on creative concepts. She would come home energized in ways that her other projects never inspired, full of stories about Marcus's vision for expanding his restaurant empire and his appreciation for her strategic insights. The second red flag had been her sudden interest in fitness and fashion, investments in herself that she attributed to wanting to project the right image for high-level clients. New gym memberships, personal shopping sessions, salon appointments that left her looking polished in ways that seemed designed for someone else's appreciation rather than her own satisfaction. The third red flag had been her growing criticism of my work habits, my dedication to projects that she suddenly saw as obsessive rather than professional. Rebecca began suggesting that I was too intense about architecture. My tendency to work through problems by sketching and thinking and iterating was somehow unhealthy compared to Marcus's ability to make quick decisions and move on to the next opportunity. By the time I recognized the pattern, Rebecca had already emotionally moved out of our marriage. She was still living in our house, still wearing her wedding ring, still maintaining the surface behaviors of a committed partner, but her heart and attention were elsewhere. Marcus had become her confidant, her adventure partner, her vision of a more exciting future that didn't include the man who'd been steadily loving her for 8 years. The heart attack had been the inevitable result of months of stress that I'd been too proud and too hopeful to acknowledge. My body had been keeping score of every late-night conversation I'd overheard. Every weekend Rebecca had found reasons to be elsewhere, every small betrayal that had accumulated into a cardiac crisis that nearly killed me. Recovery in the hospital had given me the distance and perspective to see our marriage clearly for the first time in years. Rebecca's visits were performances for the nursing staff and the hospital community, demonstrations of wifely devotion that she could reference later when people asked about her decision to file for divorce. She brought flowers that she forgot, to arrange magazines that she'd grabbed randomly from the hospital gift shop, updates about friends and family that felt more like social media posts than genuine communication. Elena's presence during those early recovery days had provided a stark contrast to Rebecca's obligatory attention. Elena asked questions because she was genuinely interested in the answers. She listened without checking her phone, responded without calculating how her words would be received, treated my recovery as a collaborative project rather than a burden to be managed efficiently. The physical therapy sessions with Elena became the highlight of my hospital stay. We started with simple exercises designed to strengthen my cardiovascular system without overstressing my healing heart. Walking short distances in the hospital, corridors, climbing a few steps, gradually increasing my endurance while monitoring my heart rate and oxygen levels. But the conversations during those sessions were what truly accelerated my healing. Alina had a gift for asking questions that helped me understand my own thoughts and feelings better than years of introspection had accomplished. She wanted to know about my work, not because she was evaluating its economic potential, but because she was genuinely curious about the creative process. "What's your favorite building that you've designed?" she asked during one of our walking sessions as we made slow circuits around the cardiac wing. I had to think about it, realizing that Rebecca had never asked me that question in 8 years of marriage. "The Children's Library branch in Southeast Portland," I said eventually. "Oh, it's not the biggest or most prestigious project, but it's the one that makes me happiest when I drive by it." "Why that one?" "Because kids don't pretend to be impressed by architecture. If a space doesn't work for them, they'll tell you immediately." Designing for children means focusing on function and wonder instead of ego and status. Plus, I get to see families using the space in ways I never anticipated. There's this reading nook I created that was supposed to be quiet and contemplative, but kids turned it into a fort-building area. It's being used differently than I planned, but it's being used joyfully. Alina smiled as we paused at a window overlooking the hospital's healing garden. That sounds like the difference between designing for clients and designing for people. Her observation was so insightful that it stopped me mid-step. Marcus had been pressuring Rebecca to convince me to bid on the architectural work for his new restaurant locations. Projects that would focus on creating Instagram-worthy spaces for people who valued appearance over authenticity. I had been reluctant to pursue the work, claiming that restaurant design wasn't my specialty. But Elena's comment helped me understand my real hesitation. I didn't want to design spaces for Marcus's ego. Rebecca thinks I should be more business-minded. About my work, I said, surprised by how easily I could discuss my marriage with Alina. She says I'm too idealistic, that I turn down profitable projects because they don't inspire me. And what do you think? Another Alina question that required honest self-examination. I think she's probably right about the business side. I could make more money if I were willing to compromise my vision for client demands. But I also think that's not the kind of architect I want to be. Alina nodded as we resumed walking. It sounds like you know exactly what kind of architect you want to be. The question is whether you're in relationships that support that vision or require you to compromise it. The plural form of relationships wasn't lost on me. Alina was, gently suggesting that my professional integrity and personal happiness were connected, that Rebecca's pressure to change my business approach might be symptomatic of larger incompatibilities in our marriage. That evening, Rebecca arrived with takeout from one of Marcus's restaurants, a gesture that might have seemed thoughtful if I hadn't known about their relationship. The food was excellent, artfully presented and expertly seasoned, but it tasted like evidence of betrayal rather than a caring meal. "Marcus wanted to make sure you were getting proper nutrition during your recovery," Rebecca said, arranging the containers on my bedside table with unnecessary precision. "He feels terrible that stress from his project might have contributed to your heart attack." The audacity of Marcus sending me food while sleeping with my wife was breathtaking. But Rebecca delivered the message as if it were a genuine expression of concern, rather than a calculated insult. I ate mechanically, wondering if this was how she rationalized her behavior by convincing herself that Marcus cared about my well-being, even as he systematically destroyed my marriage. "How long have you been having the affair?" I asked quietly, setting down my fork and meeting Rebecca's startled gaze. Her face went through a series of expressions: surprise, indignation, calculation, and finally, resignation. "David, I don't know what you're talking about." "Yes, you do. The question is whether you're going to keep lying about it, or if we're going to have an honest conversation for the first time in months." Rebecca's hands trembled as she closed the takeout containers, her composed facade cracking under the weight of being directly confronted. "It's not what you think. What I think is that you've been emotionally and physically involved with Marcus Williams for at least 6 months. That you've been planning to leave our marriage, but waiting for the right moment to minimize the social and financial consequences, and that my heart attack has complicated your timeline, but not changed your ultimate goal." She stared at me with a mixture of fear and amazement, as if I'd suddenly developed the ability to read her mind. "How long have you known?" "I saw the text message 3 days before my surgery." The one where Marcus talked about me being out of the picture. Rebecca's face went pale, and she sank into the bedside chair as if her legs could no longer support her weight. David, I never wanted it to happen this way. How did you want it to happen? She was quiet for a long time, staring at her hands while tears that seemed genuine fell onto her lap. I wanted to wait until you were healthier. I didn't want to hurt you while you were recovering. You wanted to wait until you could leave without looking like the villain? Rebecca's silence confirmed what I already knew. Even her confession was strategic, timed to minimize her guilt rather than honor our relationship with honesty. She had calculated that my recovery would provide cover for her departure, that people would understand a woman leaving a marriage after a health crisis rather than during one. I do love you, David, she said eventually. I'll always love you. But I'm not in love with you anymore, and I haven't been for a long time. And Marcus? Marcus makes me feel alive in ways I'd forgotten were possible. He's spontaneous and exciting, and he sees a future for me that's bigger than anything I'd imagined for myself. I nodded, surprised by how little anger I felt. Rebecca's words hurt, but they also provided clarity that was almost liberating. What do you want to? Do I want to end our marriage honestly? I want to divide our assets fairly? I want to remain friends if that's possible? And I want you to be happy, I said, meaning it completely. Even if that happiness doesn't include me. Rebecca looked up with surprise that suggested she'd expected anger, recrimination, or desperate attempts to save our relationship. Instead, I felt relief that we were finally being honest with each other, even if that honesty was confirming the end of our marriage. You're not going to fight for us? Who would I be fighting for? You've already left, Rebecca. Your body is still here, but your heart has been somewhere else for months. I'm not going to try to convince you to stay in a marriage you don't want. She cried then, tears that seemed to contain grief for what we'd lost and relief for what she was gaining permission to pursue. I held her hand while she sobbed, offering comfort to the woman who was leaving me because that's who I was, someone who chose kindness even when it wasn't reciprocated. Alina appeared in the doorway during Rebecca's emotional breakdown, quietly assessing the situation before stepping back into the hallway to give us privacy. But I saw her concerned expression, the way she hesitated before leaving. And I knew that my conversation with Rebecca had been overheard by someone who cared about my well-being. After Rebecca left that night, Alina returned with tea and the kind of presence that didn't require explanation or justification. She sat beside my bed while I stared out the window at the Portland lights, processing the end of my marriage and the beginning of whatever came next. Are you okay? She asked. Eventually, I think so. Sad, but okay. Maybe relieved. I've been fighting to save something that was already gone. At least now I can stop pretending and start figuring out what I actually want. Alina smiled, and in that moment, I began to understand what I might want. Not immediately, not while. I was still married, and she was still my healthcare provider. But someday, when the timing was appropriate, and my heart had healed enough to risk loving someone new. Recovery is about more than fixing what's broken, Alina said. Sometimes it's about discovering what's possible. Over the following days, Rebecca's visits became shorter and less frequent. She was giving me space to process our conversation, but she was also gradually extracting herself from the daily reality of my recovery. Marcus never visited, though his influence was everywhere in the expensive flowers Rebecca brought, in the restaurant meals she delivered, in the subtle changes, in her appearance that suggested someone was helping her choose her outfits. Alina, meanwhile, became an increasingly important part of my healing process. Our physical therapy sessions expanded to include longer walks, more challenging exercises, and conversations that ranged from architecture to travel to books to the strange ways that major life changes could reveal previously hidden aspects of personality. I learned that Alina had become a cardiac rehabilitation specialist after her father's heart attack when she was in college. She'd watched him struggle with depression during his recovery. Was frustrated by medical professionals who treated his heart without addressing his emotional needs. Her approach to patient care was holistic, recognizing that healing required attention to both physical and psychological wellness. Alina had studied architecture briefly before switching to healthcare. Was drawn to the idea of designing spaces, but ultimately more interested in helping people navigate the spaces of their own lives. She understood the language of design in ways that made our conversations richer and more collaborative. What will you do differently when you go back to work? She asked during one of our rooftop garden sessions. I'm not sure I'll go back to work the same way, I said. This whole experience has made me question whether I've been designing the right kinds of projects for the right reasons. What would the right reasons be? Creating spaces that make people's lives better, focusing on community impact rather than client ego, working with people who share my values instead of people who see me as a vendor? Elena nodded thoughtfully. That sounds like the difference between a job and a calling. What about you? Is healthcare a calling for you? Absolutely. But specifically, helping people rediscover their strength after trauma. There's something incredibly powerful about witnessing someone realize they're capable of more than they thought possible. I looked at Elena's face as she spoke, seeing the passion and purpose that animated her work, and I felt something I hadn't experienced in years. Genuine attraction based on shared values rather than convenient compatibility. Elena cared about the same things I cared about, using her skills to make a positive impact. Treating people with dignity and respect, finding meaning in work that served something larger than personal ambition. But she was my healthcare provider, and I was still technically married. And the timing was all wrong for exploring the feelings that were developing between us. Instead, I focused on recovery, on preparing myself physically and emotionally for whatever came next, on learning to trust my own judgment after years of second-guessing my instincts about my marriage. Rebecca filed for divorce 2 weeks after our honest conversation, citing irreconcilable differences and requesting a division of assets that was fair enough to avoid litigation. She had consulted with lawyers who specialized in making divorce as painless as possible for both parties, another indication that she had been planning her exit strategy for longer than she'd admitted. I signed the papers without protest, grateful that we could end our marriage with dignity rather than acrimony. Rebecca would keep the house in Beaverton, which had always been more her vision than mine. I would keep my architectural practice in the downtown loft I'd been considering as a home office space. The divorce proceedings moved quickly, helped by Rebecca's desire to marry Marcus as soon as legally possible, and my willingness to cooperate with arrangements that freed both of us to pursue the futures we actually wanted, dissolved into paperwork and asset division with surprising efficiency. Elena was professionally supportive throughout the divorce process, helping me manage the stress of legal proceedings while maintaining my cardiac health. She never commented directly on my situation, but her presence during that difficult period was steadying in ways that went beyond medical care. My last day in the hospital arrived sooner than I had expected, my recovery ahead of schedule thanks to Elena's expertise and my body's surprising resilience. I was cleared to return home with restrictions on activity and regular follow-up appointments that would continue my rehabilitation on an outpatient basis. Elena would continue to be my cardiac rehabilitation specialist, but our relationship would necessarily change once I was no longer a patient in her direct care. The daily conversations, the rooftop garden sessions, the easy intimacy of shared recovery would be replaced by more formal professional interactions. Are you ready for the next phase? Elena asked as she reviewed my discharge instructions. I think so. Nervous but ready. Yeah. Nervous means you're taking it seriously. Ready means you're prepared to do the work. Die. I wanted to tell her how much her support had meant to me, how her care had been the foundation of my healing, how I hoped our relationship could continue in some form once the professional boundaries were no longer necessary. Instead, I thanked her for her excellent medical care and promised to follow all of her recommendations for continued recovery. But as I gathered my belongings and prepared to leave the hospital that had been my home for nearly 3 weeks, knew that Elena Rodriguez had saved more than my heart. She had helped me remember who I was before stress and disappointment and a failing. Marriage had convinced me to accept less than I deserved. Leaving the hospital meant beginning the next chapter of my life, divorced, recovering, and cautiously optimistic about possibilities I was only beginning to imagine. Elena had shown me what it felt like to be seen, understood, and valued by someone who brought out my best qualities rather than highlighting my limitations. The future was uncertain, but for the first time in years, uncertainty felt like opportunity. Rather than threat, turning to the loft downtown felt like moving into a life that belonged to someone else. The space had been my architectural office for 2 years, a converted warehouse unit with exposed brick walls, industrial lighting, and floor-to ceiling windows that showcased the Portland skyline I'd helped shape. Now it would serve as both workspace and home, a studio apartment for a man learning to live alone for the first time in nearly a decade. The irony wasn't lost on me that I was more comfortable in this transitional space than I'd been in the suburban house I'd shared with Rebecca. The loft felt honest in its industrial simplicity, free from the carefully curated domesticity that had characterized our marriage. Here I could spread architectural drawings across the dining table without worrying about disrupting someone else's vision of how life should look. Alina had scheduled my first outpatient rehabilitation session for the day after my discharge, a continuation of the cardiac therapy that would gradually rebuild my strength and endurance. The appointment was at the hospital's outpatient facility, a modern building adjacent to the main medical center where I'd spent 3 weeks recovering from surgery and discovering truths I'd been avoiding for months. Walking into the rehabilitation center felt like returning to familiar territory, though everything was different now that I was approaching it as an independent adult rather than a dependent patient. Alina greeted me in the reception area with the professional warmth that had characterized all our interactions. But there was something new in her manner, a subtle shift that acknowledged the changed nature of our relationship. "How are you adjusting to life outside the hospital?" she asked, as she led me to the exercise area where cardiac patients worked with various machines designed to strengthen hearts without overwhelming them. "It's quieter than I expected," I said, realizing as I spoke that the observation was more profound than it sounded. "I thought I'd miss having Rebecca around, but mostly I notice how peaceful everything feels." Alina nodded as she consulted my chart, making notes about my progress since discharge. "That's not uncommon for people who've been living with chronic stress. Sometimes relief feels strange because we're so accustomed to tension." The rehabilitation facility was designed with the same attention to healing environments that I appreciated in good architecture. Natural light, soothing colors, and carefully planned layouts that promoted movement and interaction without feeling clinical or institutional. I found myself analyzing the space with professional interest, noting design choices that supported patient well-being. The architect who designed this place understood the connection between environment and recovery. I commented as Alina showed me to a treadmill calibrated for cardiac patients. "Actually, the original design was pretty standard medical facility. Boring," Alina said with a smile. "But our previous program director had a background in environmental psychology. She insisted on renovations that would make the space feel more welcoming. The administration thought she was wasting money on aesthetics, but patient outcomes improved significantly after the changes." "What kinds of changes?" Alina gestured around the room as she adjusted the treadmill settings for my current fitness level. "Better lighting, colors that promote calm rather than anxiety, sightlines that let patients see their progress through the space. Little things that make a big difference in how people feel about their recovery." I was impressed by Alina's understanding of design principles, her recognition that physical spaces could support or hinder healing processes. Most healthcare providers I'd encountered viewed architecture as purely functional, background elements that shouldn't interfere with medical care. Alina understood that environment was part of treatment, that well-designed spaces could accelerate recovery by making patients feel cared for rather than processed. The exercise session was more challenging than our hospital walks, but manageable. Within the parameters Alina had established for my recovery, as I walked on the treadmill, maintaining a pace that elevated my heart rate without pushing beyond safe limits, we continued the kind of conversation that had characterized our relationship. "From the beginning, have you thought about how your experience might influence your architectural work?" Alina asked, monitoring my vital signs while we talked. "Every day," I said, surprised by how easily the thoughts came together when Alina asked about them. "I keep thinking about the difference between spaces that serve people and spaces that serve egos. The hospital room where I recovered was tiny, but it felt more peaceful than my house inn. Beaverton because everything in it was designed to support healing rather than impression. What would architectural work that serves people look like?" It was the kind of question Alina excelled at asking, simple on the surface, but complex in its implications. I found myself talking about community centers, affordable housing, public spaces that brought people together rather than separated them by economic status. I talked about schools that inspired learning, healthcare facilities that promoted wellness, residential projects that fostered neighborhood connection rather than isolation. It sounds like you're describing architecture as a form of service, Alina observed. I think that's exactly what it should be, not service to clients who want monuments to their success, but service to communities that need spaces where life can flourish. Alina smiled as she made notes about my exercise tolerance and recovery progress. That sounds like the difference between a job and a calling we talked about in the hospital. Our conversation was interrupted by the arrival of another patient. A woman in her 60s who'd apparently been attending cardiac rehabilitation for several weeks. She greeted Alina with the familiarity of someone who'd developed genuine affection for her healthcare provider. And Alina responded with the same warmth and attention she'd shown me throughout my recovery. Watching Alina interact with other patients gave me perspective on what I'd experienced during my hospitalization. Her care and attention weren't unique to our relationships. She treated every patient with the same dignity and respect, the same commitment to seeing them as whole human beings rather than collections of symptoms to be managed. Alina's gift wasn't personal interest in me specifically, but professional excellence applied consistently to everyone in her care. The realization was both humbling and liberating. I hadn't been imagining the connection between us, but I also hadn't been receiving special treatment that indicated romantic interest. Alina was simply extraordinary at her job, and I had been the beneficiary of her professional expertise during a period when I desperately needed to remember what excellent care felt like. After my exercise session, Alina walked me to the scheduling desk where we arranged follow-up appointments for the coming weeks. The process was routine, professional, and slightly disappointing in its normalcy. I had hoped for some indication that our relationship might develop beyond the boundaries of healthcare provider and patient, but Alina maintained appropriate professional distance throughout our interaction. "I'll see you next week," she said. As I prepared to leave, "Keep monitoring your heart rate during daily activities, and don't hesitate to call if you have concerns about anything." I thanked her and left the rehabilitation center with mixed feelings about the interaction. Alina had been professional, competent, and caring within appropriate boundaries. I had no legitimate complaint about her behavior, but I also felt disappointed by the formal nature of our exchange. During my hospitalization, our conversations had felt more personal, more connected, more like the beginning of something that could develop into friendship, or possibly more. Walking back to my loft through downtown Portland, I tried to process what felt like rejection, even though Alina hadn't actually rejected anything. I hadn't asked her out, hadn't suggested meeting outside of professional contexts, hadn't indicated that I was interested in her as anything other than my healthcare provider. My disappointment was based on possibilities I'd imagined rather than opportunities I'd actually pursued. The downtown neighborhood around my loft was experiencing the kind of urban renewal that could either strengthen communities or displace them, depending on how development was managed. New restaurants and retail spaces were opening alongside established businesses that had served the area for decades. The architecture ranged from carefully preserved historical buildings to modern structures that respected their context to unfortunate examples of development that prioritized profit over place. I found myself evaluating every building I passed with new criteria influenced by my conversations with Alina about spaces that served people rather than egos. The community bank branch that provided comfortable seating and natural light for customers waiting in line. The coffee shop that had created nooks for different kinds of social interaction tables for business meetings. Counter seating for solo work, soft chairs for casual conversation. The medical clinic that used color and artwork to create an environment that felt welcoming rather than intimidating. Good design was everywhere once I started looking for it. Often in modest buildings that prioritized function and human comfort over dramatic architectural statements. I began to understand that my most satisfying future work would likely be smaller in scale but larger in impact than the prestige projects. My architectural practice had been functioning efficiently during my recovery, thanks to my associate, Sarah Mitchell, and project manager Tom Chen, who would manage client relationships and project timelines, while I focused on healing. Returning to work felt like stepping back into a life that had been temporarily paused. Though I approached familiar tasks with perspectives that had shifted significantly during my time away, the first project I reviewed was a residential complex that Marcus Williams had proposed before my heart attack. Luxury condominiums designed to attract affluent buyers who valued location and amenities over community connection. The plans I'd developed were technically competent but uninspired, focused on maximizing square footage and premium finishes rather than creating spaces where people would actually want to live. Looking at the drawings with fresh eyes, I realized that accepting Marcus's project would mean designing buildings for the man who'd been sleeping with my wife while I was in surgery. More importantly, it would mean compromising my evolving vision of what architecture could accomplish in favor of commercial success that served no purpose beyond generating fees. I called Marcus's office and declined the project, citing philosophical differences about design approaches that made collaboration unlikely to succeed. His assistant seemed surprised by my decision, apparently. Marcus had expected me to be grateful for his business despite the personal circumstances that made our professional relationship problematic. Rebecca called that afternoon, ostensibly to check on my health, but actually to discuss the Marcus project that she'd been instrumental in securing. Her disappointment about my decision was evident, though she tried to frame her concern in terms of my professional success rather than her personal agenda. "David, you can't afford to turn down high-profile clients because of personal feelings," she said, her voice carrying the tone of someone explaining obvious principles to a confused child. "Marcus is offering you exactly the kind of project that could establish your firm at the next level." "What if I don't want to work at the next level? What do you mean? What if I'd rather design smaller projects that make a positive impact on communities instead of larger projects that mainly generate profit for developers and fees for my firm?" Rebecca was quiet for a moment, apparently processing the possibility that my priorities had shifted in ways that didn't align with her vision of success. "David, you're still recovering from major surgery. This probably isn't the time to make dramatic career decisions. Actually, nearly dying has given me excellent perspective on what kinds of career decisions I want to make, but the financial implications will be fine. I'm not planning to work for free, Rebecca. I'm planning to work for clients whose values align with mine, instead of clients who see me as a vendor for their ego projects." Our conversation ended awkwardly, with Rebecca expressing concern about my judgment and me feeling more confident about my decision than I'd felt about anything in months. Marcus's project represented everything I wanted to move away from architecture as commodity, design as status symbol, buildings as investments rather than contributions to community life. Over the following days, I began researching architects whose work embodied the principles I wanted to embrace. Firms that specialized in affordable housing, community centers, schools, healthcare facilities. Architects who collaborated with neighborhoods to understand their needs rather than imposing external visions of what development should look like. The research was inspiring and overwhelming simultaneously. There were architects doing extraordinary work with limited budgets, creating buildings that supported social justice, environmental sustainability, and community empowerment. Their projects weren't featured in glossy magazines, but they were changing lives in ways that luxury condominiums never could. I also researched cardiac rehabilitation facilities, curious about design principles that supported healing and recovery. Elena's comments about environmental psychology had sparked professional interest in healthcare architecture, a field I'd never seriously considered but that seemed to combine my skills with purposes that mattered. My second rehabilitation session with Elena went more smoothly than the first, partly because I'd adjusted my expectations to focus on professional interaction rather than personal connection. Elena was pleased with my progress, noting improvements in my cardiovascular endurance and overall energy levels that indicated my heart was healing effectively. "You seem more relaxed this week," she observed as we worked through exercises designed to strengthen my core muscles without straining my cardiovascular system. "I made some decisions about work that feel good," I said. "Turned down a project that would have been profitable but not satisfying." "That sounds like progress in itself. What kind of projects are you interested in pursuing?" I found myself describing my research into community-focused architecture, the firms whose work inspired me, the possibility of transitioning my practice toward projects that served social rather than commercial purposes. Alina listened with the same attention she brought to discussing my physical recovery, asking questions that helped me clarify my own thinking. "Have you ever considered healthcare?" "Architecture," she asked, as I finished a set of modified push-ups that left me breathing harder than I had expected. "Actually, I've been reading about it since our conversation last week. The connection between environmental design and patient outcomes is fascinating." "Okay. There's a lot of research showing that well-designed healthcare spaces can reduce recovery time, lower stress levels, even decrease the need for pain medication. But most healthcare facilities are still designed like institutions rather than healing environments." Lena's expertise in both healthcare and environmental psychology became apparent as we discussed specific design elements that supported patient well-being, natural light, views of nature, noise control, wayfinding systems that reduced anxiety, color palettes that promoted calmer architectural considerations that could significantly impact health outcomes. "Would you ever be interested in consulting on healthcare projects?" Alina asked as our session concluded. "I know several facility administrators who are planning renovations and struggling to balance medical functionality with patient experience." The suggestion caught me off guard, both because it represented a potential professional opportunity and because it indicated Elena's confidence in my abilities. She was offering to connect me with work that aligned with my values, while also creating opportunities for us to collaborate professionally. "I'd be very interested," I said, trying to match Elena's professional tone while internally celebrating the possibility of working with her in some capacity. "Let me make some calls and see what's available." Healthcare architecture requires understanding medical workflows as well as design principles, but it's exactly the kind of work that makes a real difference in people's lives. Leaving the rehabilitation center that day, I felt energized in ways that went beyond the physical benefits of exercise. Alina had offered me a pathway toward meaningful work, validation of my shifting priorities, and the possibility of professional collaboration that could develop into something more personal over time. The following week brought my first potential: healthcare architecture, consultation, a meeting with Dr. Patricia Moore at a community clinic that served uninsured and underinsured patients in East Portland. Alina had arranged the introduction, describing me as an architect interested in projects that prioritized social impact over profit margins. Dr. Moore was a woman in her 50s who had spent her career providing medical care to Portland's most vulnerable populations. Her clinic operated on tight budgets and relied heavily on volunteer support. But she understood that the physical environment significantly impacted both patient experience and staff effectiveness. Was designed as office suites, Dr. Moore explained as she gave me a tour of the clinic's cramped quarters. "We've adapted it for medical use, but the layout creates bottlenecks. The lighting is terrible, and patients feel like they're being processed through a bureaucracy rather than receiving health care." Walking through the clinic, I could see exactly what Dr. Moore meant. The space felt institutional and unwelcoming, with narrow corridors, harsh fluorescent lighting, and examination rooms that were too small for effective patient care. But I could also see possibilities for improvement that wouldn't require massive renovation budgets. "What if we focused on creating a sense of flow through the space?" I suggested, sketching rough ideas as we talked. Wider corridors that double as informal waiting areas, examination rooms that feel more like comfortable offices than medical facilities, natural lighting wherever possible. Dr. Moore's enthusiasm for design improvements was infectious. She understood that patient care extended beyond medical treatment to include the entire experience of seeking healthcare. From parking to check-in to examination to departure, environmental improvements could reduce patient anxiety, improve staff morale, and create a sense of dignity for people who often felt marginalized by the healthcare system. Our consultation extended well beyond the scheduled hour as we discussed possibilities for transforming the clinic's atmosphere without exceeding their limited renovation budget. I found myself energized by the challenge of creating maximum impact. With minimal resources, designing solutions that prioritized human needs over aesthetic preferences. "Alina Rodriguez recommended you," Dr. Moore mentioned as our meeting concluded. "She said you were someone who understood that architecture could be a form of service." Alina has been instrumental in my recovery, I said. She's also helped me understand the connection between environmental design and healing. She's extraordinary at what she does. The cardiac patients who work with Alina consistently have better outcomes than the average, partly because she treats the whole person, rather than just the medical condition. Dr. Moore's comment reinforced my growing appreciation for Alina's professional excellence. Lena, while also highlighting the challenge of transitioning from patient to potential romantic interest. Elena's care and attention during my recovery hadn't been personal preference. They were professional standards she applied to everyone in her care. The healthcare architecture consultation led to additional opportunities over the following weeks. Elena's professional network included facility administrators, medical directors, and healthcare providers who were frustrated with institutional environments that hindered rather than supported their work. My background in architecture combined with my recent experience as a patient gave me perspectives that purely commercial architects often lacked. Each project was modest in scope, but significant in impact: a pediatric clinic that needed child-friendly design elements, a mental health facility that required spaces promoting calm and privacy, a physical therapy center that wanted to integrate healing gardens with exercise areas. The work was satisfying in ways that luxury residential projects had never been, creating spaces that genuinely improved people's lives. Lena and I developed a professional relationship that extended beyond my cardiac rehabilitation appointments. She occasionally consulted on projects where her expertise in patient psychology could inform design decisions. And I began to understand healthcare architecture as collaborative work that required input from medical professionals who understood how spaces affected treatment outcomes. Our collaboration was productive and increasingly comfortable, though we maintained careful professional boundaries that prevented our working relationship from developing into personal friendship. Lena was friendly, but not intimate, collaborative, but not confiding, supportive, but not romantic in her interactions with me. The tension between professional respect and personal attraction was becoming more noticeable as my physical recovery progressed and my emotional availability increased. I was no longer a vulnerable patient dependent on Elena's care. I was no longer a married man processing the end of his relationship. But I was still Elena's patient, and she was still my healthcare provider, which created ethical boundaries that neither of us seemed prepared to cross. My divorce from Rebecca was finalized on a rainy Thursday in November, 8 months after my heart attack and 6 months after our honest conversation in the hospital. The legal process had been straightforward, helped by Rebecca's eagerness to remarry Marcus and my willingness to cooperate with asset division that freed both of us to pursue our respective futures. Signing the final papers felt less like ending and more like acknowledging what had already concluded months earlier. Rebecca and I exchanged pleasantries about our respective health and career plans. But we were already strangers to each other. People who had shared 8 years of life but no longer shared anything beyond legal obligations that were finally being resolved. That evening, I called Elena to inform her that my divorce was final, thinking that the change in my marital status might create opportunities for our relationship to develop beyond professional collaboration. Her response was congratulatory, but not particularly enthusiastic, suggesting that my personal circumstances were less relevant to her than I'd hoped. "How are you feeling about everything?" she asked, her tone carrying the same professional concern she'd shown throughout my recovery. Relieved, mostly, ready to start the next chapter. "That's wonderful, David. You've handled everything with such grace and strength. I wanted to ask Alina if she'd be interested in having dinner sometime, in exploring the possibility of personal relationship now that professional boundaries were less restrictive. Instead, I thanked her for her support and ended the conversation with the same polite distance that had characterized all our recent interactions. My hesitation wasn't fear of rejection as much as uncertainty about Elena's interest. She had been consistently caring and supportive, but never in ways that suggested romantic attraction. Her professional excellence included maintaining appropriate boundaries with patients, which meant that her behavior toward me might have been entirely therapeutic rather than personal. The question of Elena's feelings became more pressing as my cardiac rehabilitation program neared completion. Medical treatment concluded we would have no professional reason to maintain regular contact. If I wanted to pursue a personal relationship with Alina, I needed to express that interest before our healthcare provider-patient relationship ended, and we returned to being strangers who occasionally collaborated on architecture projects. Approaching Alina romantically required confidence that she might reciprocate my interest, and I had no reliable evidence that her care for me extended beyond professional obligation. The same qualities that made her an excellent healthcare provider, empathy, attention, genuine concern for patient well-being, could easily be mistaken for personal interest by someone who had been emotionally vulnerable during their recovery. As my final rehabilitation session approached, I found myself planning conversations that would allow me to gauge Elena's interest without jeopardizing our professional relationship or making her uncomfortable. The transition from patient to potential romantic partner required navigation of complex emotional and ethical territory that I wasn't entirely prepared to handle. But the alternative, completing my medical treatment and returning to ordinary life without exploring the possibility of relationship with Alina, felt like accepting defeat before attempting victory. Alina had been instrumental in my recovery, not just from cardiac surgery, but from the emotional trauma of discovering my marriage's hollowness and rebuilding my sense of self-worth. The next phase of my life would require the same courage that had carried me through surgery, divorce, and career reinvention. If Alina was interested in exploring personal relationship, I wanted to give her the opportunity to express that interest. If she wasn't interested, I wanted to know definitively so I could appreciate our professional collaboration without hoping for something more. Either way, the conversation needed to happen soon. My final cardiac rehabilitation session was scheduled for a Thursday morning in December, exactly 4 months after my heart surgery and 3 weeks after my divorce became official. Walking into the rehabilitation center that morning felt different than all the previous visits. This wasn't just another step in my recovery, but a graduation of sorts. The conclusion of a medical relationship that had become the foundation for rebuilding my entire life. Lena greeted me with her usual professional warmth, but I detected something different in her manner as well. Perhaps it was my imagination, or perhaps she was also aware that our therapeutic relationship was ending, and whatever came next would require different kinds of conversations and connections. "How are you feeling about completing the program?" she asked as we began the final exercise session, her tone carrying genuine interest in my emotional state rather than just my physical progress. "Proud of how far I've come, but also nervous about what happens next," I admitted. "These sessions have been anchors in my week for months. Not sure what structure will replace them." Alina smiled as she made notes on my chart, documenting the remarkable progress I'd made since those first tentative walks through hospital corridors. "Next, the structure will be whatever you create for yourself. That's the real test of recovery learning. To maintain your health and well-being independently, we worked through the exercise routine that had become familiar over the past several months. But today, each movement felt significant, a final demonstration of my body's return to strength and resilience. My heart rate remained stable during activities that would have been impossible immediately after surgery. My endurance had improved dramatically. My confidence in my physical capabilities had been restored. But the conversation during exercise was what I would remember most about. That final session, Alina asked questions that went beyond medical assessment to explore how the recovery experience had changed my perspectives on life, work, and relationships. Her questions felt more personal than usual, as if she was genuinely curious about who I was becoming rather than simply monitoring my progress toward predetermined health outcomes. "What surprised you most about the recovery process?" she asked, as I completed a series of weight-bearing exercises designed to strengthen my cardiovascular system. "Much mental and emotional healing happened alongside the physical recovery," I said. "I expected to get my heart fixed and return to normal life. Instead, I ended up rebuilding everything. My marriage ended. My career focus shifted. My priorities completely changed." "Do you see those changes as positive?" "Absolutely. The person I was before the heart attack was slowly killing himself with stress and compromise. The person I'm becoming feels more authentic, more purposeful." Lena nodded thoughtfully as she checked my pulse and blood pressure, noting the excellent readings that indicated my cardiovascular system was functioning better than it had in years. "It sounds like the heart attack saved your life in more ways than one." "It definitely did. and you were a huge part of that salvation. The comment was more direct than anything I'd said previously about Elena's impact on my recovery, and I watched her face carefully for her reaction. She looked pleased, but not surprised, as if she'd been aware of her role in my transformation, but hadn't expected me to acknowledge it so explicitly. It's been a privilege to work with you, David. You approached recovery with such openness and determination. Not all patients are willing to examine their lives as thoroughly as you did. As we completed the final exercises and Elena documented my progress for the medical record, I realized that this might be my last opportunity to have an honest conversation with her about the feelings that had developed during our professional relationship. Once I left the rehabilitation center, she would no longer be my healthcare provider, but she also wouldn't have any particular reason to maintain contact with me. "Elena," I said as she finished her documentation, "can I ask you something personal?" She looked up from her tablet with an expression that was open but cautious. "Of course, during my recovery I've developed feelings for you that go beyond appreciation for excellent medical care. I'm wondering if those feelings might be mutual, or if what I've interpreted as personal connection was actually just professional competence." Elena was quiet for a long moment, her face cycling through expressions that suggested she was carefully considering how to respond. When she finally spoke, her voice was gentle but clear. "David, I've been hoping you would ask that question." The relief I felt at her words was overwhelming, but Elena continued speaking before I could respond. "Professional ethics require that I maintain boundaries with patients, which is why I've never given you any indication of my personal feelings. But yes, I've developed feelings for you too. I've been impressed by your strength, your thoughtfulness, your commitment to using your experience to help other people. I've enjoyed our conversations more than any professional interaction should probably be enjoyed. So what happens now?" Elena smiled, and for the first time since I'd known her, the smile seemed to contain possibilities that extended beyond cardiac rehabilitation. "Now we figure out if what we've felt during your recovery can develop into something real outside of a medical context." "I'd like to try." "So would I, but I want to be honest about the complexities. You've been through enormous life changes in a very short period. Divorce, career transitions, health crises, those are all major stressors that can affect judgment and decision-making. I want to make sure that your interest in me isn't just gratitude or rebound emotions from your marriage ending." Elena's caution was reasonable and professionally appropriate, but it also indicated the thoughtfulness that had attracted me to her in the first place. She was considering my well-being even as she acknowledged mutual attraction, prioritizing my long-term emotional health over immediate romantic possibilities. "What would help you feel confident that my feelings are genuine?" I asked. "Time and getting to know each other outside of the healthcare context where we met. I'd like to see how we connect when I'm not your rehabilitation specialist and you're not my patient. Would you have dinner with me? I'd love to have dinner with you." The conversation that followed was unlike any we'd shared during my months of medical treatment. Elena asked about my architectural work, my goals for the healthcare projects I'd been developing, my thoughts about life in Portland, and what I wanted to do with the fresh start my recovery had provided. Asked about her background, her family, her interests outside of cardiac rehabilitation, her dreams for her career and personal life. We discovered compatibility that extended far beyond the professional relationship that had introduced us. Elena was passionate about travel, particularly to places where she could experience different approaches to healthcare and community wellness. I was increasingly interested in sustainable architecture that supported environmental health alongside human health. She valued creativity and intellectual curiosity. I appreciated her commitment to service and her understanding of how individual healing connected to broader social well-being. The more we talked, the more I understood that my attraction to Elena wasn't based on gratitude or vulnerability, but on genuine compatibility and shared values. She was intelligent, compassionate, and purposeful in ways that complemented my own personality and priorities. Our connection felt natural rather than circumstantial. "I should probably mention," Elena said, as our conversation continued, "that I've never dated a former patient before. I'll be navigating new professional territory." "I've never dated my cardiac rehabilitation specialist either," I replied, which made her laugh. "Suppose we'll figure it out together." Our first date was scheduled for the following Saturday evening, a week that felt simultaneously endless and too short as I anticipated the transition from professional relationship to personal exploration. Alina suggested a restaurant in Southeast Portland that supported local farmers and focused on healthy, sustainable cuisine choice that reflected both her nutritional expertise and her values about community support. The restaurant was exactly the kind of place I'd hoped Alina would choose, thoughtfully designed. Environmentally conscious, staffed by people who seemed genuinely happy to be working there. The space felt welcoming rather than pretentious, focused on creating an atmosphere where conversation could flourish rather than impress. Alina arrived wearing a dress I'd never seen before, her hair loose instead of pulled back in the professional ponytail I'd grown accustomed to during rehabilitation sessions. She looked beautiful in ways that were both familiar and completely new. The same person who had guided my recovery, but also someone I was meeting for the first time. "You look wonderful," I said, as we were seated at a table near the restaurant's windows, which overlooked a small garden where herbs and vegetables grew despite the December weather. "Thank you. You look pretty wonderful yourself. Strange. Seeing you in regular clothes instead of hospital gowns or exercise gear?" The initial awkwardness of transitioning from healthcare provider and patient to potential romantic partners lasted about 15 minutes, dissolving as we fell into the kind of conversation that had characterized our relationship from the beginning. Alina asked about my week. I found myself describing the healthcare architecture projects I'd been developing with enthusiasm that surprised me. "Dr. Moore wants to expand the community clinic," I said, describing the renovation plans that would transform the cramped medical offices into a welcoming healthcare facility. "We're designing spaces that feel more like a community center than a medical institution. Healing gardens, comfortable family areas, examination rooms with natural lighting. That sounds exactly like the kind of work you were talking about." "During recovery," Alina said, "creating spaces that serve people rather than egos. Your influence actually..." The conversations we had about environmental psychology completely changed how I think about architecture. I never considered how much physical spaces could impact health outcomes until I experienced it as a patient. Alina smiled as she considered her role in my professional transformation. "I love that your architecture is becoming a form of healthcare. There's so much research showing that well-designed environments can promote healing. But most architects don't understand the medical implications of their work." Our conversation flowed naturally from professional topics to personal interests, family backgrounds, travel experiences, and philosophical perspectives on life and work. Alina described growing up in a family where service to others was considered the highest calling, which explained her commitment to healthcare and her understanding of work as vocation rather than merely career. I told her about my childhood fascination with buildings and spaces, the way I'd always been more interested in how places made people feel than in architectural styles or construction techniques. Alina understood intuitively that architecture could be emotional as well as functional, that spaces could support human flourishing or hinder it depending on how thoughtfully they were designed. "What kind of travel appeals to you?" Alina asked as we shared dessert, a question that opened up discussions about places we wanted to visit and experiences we hoped to have. "I'd love to see examples of architecture that integrates with natural environments rather than imposing on them," I said. "Scandinavian healthcare facilities, Japanese temples, indigenous building techniques that work with climate instead of against it. I've always wanted to visit communities where traditional healing practices are integrated with modern medicine," Alina replied. "Places where healthcare acknowledges the whole person rather than just treating symptoms in isolation." The compatibility of our interests was remarkable, suggesting possibilities for shared adventures that could combine our professional passions with personal exploration. Alina's curiosity about different approaches to healthcare matched my interest in sustainable and culturally responsive architecture. As the evening progressed, I became increasingly confident that my feelings for Alina were based on genuine connection rather than circumstantial attraction. She was intelligent, thoughtful, and passionate about work that made a positive impact on other people's lives. Her values aligned with mine. Her personality complemented my temperament. Her presence made me feel more interesting and capable than I'd felt in years. "Can I ask you about your marriage?" Elena said as we prepared to leave the restaurant. "I don't want to pry, but I'm curious about what you learned from that experience." The question was delicate but fair, indicating Elena's desire to understand my relationship history before committing to romantic involvement. I appreciated her directness and her recognition that my recent divorce was relevant to whatever might develop between us. "I learned that compatibility on paper doesn't guarantee emotional connection," I said. "Rebecca and I looked good together, shared similar backgrounds and goals, but we never really understood each other. We were business partners more than romantic partners." "What would you want to be different in a future relationship?" "Authenticity instead of performance. Mutual support rather than parallel ambition. Someone who sees my work as meaningful rather than just economically successful." Elena nodded thoughtfully. "Those sound like lessons that could only be learned through experience. What about you? What did you learn from your divorce?" "That I'm not willing to compromise my values for someone else's vision of success. My ex-husband wanted me to be a doctor's wife rather than a healthcare professional in my own right. He saw my career as a hobby that should accommodate his schedule and priorities." Elena's experience resonated with mine in ways that suggested we'd both learned similar lessons about the importance of mutual respect and shared values in romantic relationships. Neither of us was interested in repeating patterns that had led to failed marriages. Walking Elena to her car after dinner felt like approaching a moment of decision about whether our relationship would continue developing. The evening had confirmed that we enjoyed each other's company outside of professional contexts, but it had also raised questions about timing, compatibility, whether we were both emotionally available for serious romantic involvement. "I had a wonderful time tonight," Elena said as we reached her car, her words carrying warmth that seemed genuine rather than polite. "So did I. I'd love to see you again if you're interested." "I'm very interested. But I want to continue taking things slowly. You're still processing major life changes, and I don't want either of us to rush into something we're not ready for." Elena's caution was disappointing but understandable. She was protecting both of us from potential complications that could arise from moving too quickly from professional relationship to romantic involvement. Her thoughtfulness was one of the qualities that attracted me to her, even when it meant delaying gratification. "What would taking things slowly look like?" I asked. "More dates like this one, getting to know each other in different contexts, maybe meeting each other's friends and family, seeing how we handle stress and conflict together." "That sounds reasonable and terrifying." Lena laughed, and the sound made me feel hopeful about our prospects, despite her emphasis on gradual development. The good kind of terrifying, I hope. Our second date was a Saturday afternoon visit to the Portland Art Museum, where Elena wanted to see an exhibition about healing traditions from different cultures. The choice revealed her intellectual curiosity and her interest in approaches to wellness that transcended traditional Western medicine. Walking through the museum together felt natural and comfortable, as if we'd been exploring art exhibitions as a couple for years rather than navigating our second official date. Elena's observations about the artwork were thoughtful and informed, reflecting education that extended beyond her medical training to include appreciation for cultural history and artistic expression. "This piece reminds me of the Cardiac Rehabilitation Center," Elena said, stopping in front of a painting that depicted a garden where people were engaged in various healing activities. "The way the artist shows healing as community activity rather than individual struggle." "That's exactly what you create in your work," I replied. "Rehabilitation that acknowledges the social and emotional aspects of recovery, not just the physical components." Elena's smile suggested that she appreciated my understanding of her professional approach, but she also seemed surprised by the depth of my observation. During my months as her patient, she'd been focused on my needs rather than explaining her methodology. Now she was discovering that I'd been paying attention to her techniques and philosophy in ways that went beyond personal benefit. The museum visit extended into early evening as we found ourselves engrossed in conversations about art, healing, creativity, and the ways that cultural traditions could inform contemporary approaches to healthcare and architecture. Elena's knowledge was impressive, and her ability to connect artistic concepts to practical applications in her work revealed intellectual sophistication that made her even more attractive. Have you ever considered teaching? I asked as we sat in the museum cafe, continuing conversations that had begun in the galleries. Actually, I've been thinking about developing continuing education programs for healthcare providers, Alina said. Most medical training focuses on clinical skills, but ignores environmental factors that affect patient outcomes. I'd love to teach other rehabilitation specialists about the connection between physical spaces and healing. That sounds like something I could contribute to as well. Healthcare architecture from the patient perspective. Elena's eyes lit up with enthusiasm that suggested she'd been hoping I would offer to collaborate on educational projects. We could develop a whole curriculum about evidence-based design for healthcare facilities. Bring together medical professionals and architects to create truly therapeutic environments. The possibility of professional collaboration added another dimension to our developing personal relationship, creating opportunities to combine our expertise in service of shared goals. Lena and I both valued work that made a positive impact on other people's lives, and together we could potentially influence healthcare design throughout the region. Our third date was a hiking trip to Mount Hood, Lena's suggestion for an activity that would test our compatibility in outdoor settings, while providing opportunities for extended conversation away from urban distractions. The December weather was crisp but clear, perfect for moderate hiking that wouldn't overstress my still recovering cardiovascular system. Elena's consideration for my physical limitations was thoughtful without being patronizing. She chose trails that would provide good exercise without pushing beyond my current capabilities. And she monitored my condition throughout the hike with professional subtlety. That didn't make me feel like a patient under medical supervision. How does it feel to be doing this kind of activity again? She asked, as we paused at a scenic overlook that provided views of the Columbia River Gorge. Incredible. 8 months ago, I couldn't walk up a flight of stairs without chest pain. Now I'm hiking mountains. Your recovery has been remarkable, not just physically, but emotionally. You've used this experience to completely transform your life. Elena's recognition of my growth felt like validation of choices that had sometimes seemed overwhelming in their scope and implications. Ending my marriage, changing my career focus, restructuring my entire approach to life and work, all of these decisions had felt necessary but also frightening in their irreversibility. I couldn't have done it without your support, I said. You helped me understand that recovery was about more than just fixing my heart. You did the work, David. I just provided some guidance and encouragement. Elena's modesty was characteristic, but I wanted her to understand the significance of her role in my transformation. Her care during my most vulnerable period had restored my faith in the possibility of authentic connection with another person. Her professional excellence had demonstrated what supportive relationships could look like when they prioritized well-being over convenience. The hiking date confirmed that Elena and I enjoyed each other's company in various contexts and shared values about health, nature, and work-life balance. Our conversations flowed naturally, whether we were discussing professional goals, family, backgrounds, or philosophical perspectives on life and relationships. But the hiking trip also revealed Elena's continuing caution about the pace of our relationship development. She maintained friendly, but not intimate physical boundaries, treating our time together as friendship exploration rather than romantic courtship. Her restraint was frustrating but also reassuring, indicating that she was taking our potential relationship seriously enough to proceed thoughtfully. After 6 weeks of regular dates, I felt confident that Elena and I were compatible in ways that could support a serious romantic relationship. She was intelligent, compassionate, professionally accomplished, and personally grounded in values that aligned with mine. Our conversations were engaging, our shared activities were enjoyable, and our professional collaboration was productive. But Elena continued to emphasize the importance of taking things slowly. I began to wonder if her caution was protecting us from rushing into something premature, or preventing us from exploring something that was ready to develop more fully. The turning point came during our 7th date, a dinner at my loft where I cooked for Elena, and we spent the evening discussing our respective visions for the future. I had prepared a meal that accommodated Elena's nutritional expertise while showcasing my own modest culinary skills. And the domestic intimacy of sharing a home-cooked meal felt like a natural progression in our relationship. "This is delicious," Elena said as we ate the salmon and winter vegetables I'd prepared. and your loft is beautiful. I love how you've maintained the industrial character while making it feel warm and welcoming. It's still a work in progress, I said. I'm thinking about adding some plants, maybe creating a small garden area. On the roof? That sounds wonderful. There's so much research showing that access to nature improves both physical and mental health. Our conversation during dinner touched on professional projects, personal goals, and shared interests. But there was an underlying tension that hadn't been present during our previous dates. Alina seemed more relaxed in my home environment, but also more aware of the intimate implications of spending evening together in private rather than public spaces. After dinner, we moved to the living area where floor-to-ceiling windows provided views of the Portland skyline I'd helped design. Alina curled up on the couch with a glass of wine, looking more comfortable and natural than I'd seen her since our relationship had transitioned from professional to personal. "Can I ask you something?" I said, settling beside her with my own. "Wine? Always. Are you happy with how things are developing between us, or are you holding back because you're not sure about your feelings?" Alina was quiet for a long moment, considering her response with the same thoughtfulness she brought to all difficult conversations. "I'm holding back because I'm very sure about my feelings, and that scares me." Her answer surprised me. I interpreted her caution as uncertainty rather than fear of certainty. "What scares you about being sure? You've been through enormous changes in the past year? Heart surgery, divorce, career transition? Any one of those would be a major life event? I'm concerned that your feelings for me might be part of the general upheaval rather than something that will last once your life stabilizes." Elena's concern was thoughtful and legitimate, but it also suggested that she was protecting herself from potential heartbreak as much as protecting me from poor decision-making. Her investment in our relationship was deep enough that losing it would be painful, which explained her emphasis on proceeding slowly. "What would convince you that my feelings are stable rather than circumstantial?" I asked, time, and seeing how we handle challenges together. "So far we've only experienced each other in positive contexts. I want to see how we communicate during stress, how we resolve disagreements, how we support each other when life gets difficult. What kind of challenges did you have in mind?" Lena smiled, and I could see her making a decision that would change the direction of our conversation. "Actually, I have something to tell you that might create our first real test." I set down my wine glass and gave Alina my full attention, sensing that whatever she was about to share would be significant. "I've been offered a position in Seattle," she said. "Director of Cardiac Rehabilitation for a hospital system that's implementing innovative approaches to patient care. It's an incredible opportunity to influence healthcare design and treatment protocols on a much larger scale." The news hit me like a physical blow, not because Alina didn't deserve the opportunity, but because it represented a potential end to the relationship we'd been carefully building. Seattle was only 3 hours away, but long-distance relationships were complicated even under the best circumstances. "That sounds like an amazing opportunity," I said, trying to keep my voice neutral despite the disappointment I felt. "Would you start?" "That's what I need to figure out. The position is available now, but I could negotiate a start date that gives me time to transition my current patients and make personal arrangements." "Personal arrangements?" Alina met my gaze directly, and I could see that she was as conflicted about the decision as I was about the news. "Deciding whether I have reasons to stay in Portland that outweigh the professional advantages of moving to Seattle." The implication was clear. Alina was asking whether our relationship was serious enough to influence her career decisions. It was the kind of moment that could either deepen our commitment or reveal that we weren't as invested in each other as we'd believed. "What do you want to do?" I asked. "I want to stay in Portland and see where this relationship leads. But I also want to be smart about my career and not make decisions based on a relationship that's only been developing for 2 months." Elena's honesty was both painful and admirable. She was acknowledging that our relationship was important to her while also recognizing that it was still too new to justify major life decisions. Her conflict reflected the same tension I was feeling between emotional attachment and practical considerations. "What if we approach this as an opportunity rather than a crisis?" I suggested. "What if you took the Seattle position, and we use the challenge of long-distance relationship to test whether what we have is strong enough to survive complications?" Alina looked surprised by my suggestion, as if she'd expected me to argue against her taking the position. You'd be willing to try long distance? If the alternative is not trying at all, then yes. And Seattle isn't that far. I could see each other on weekends, and I could potentially develop healthcare architecture projects there as well. You'd consider relocating? The question forced me to examine my own feelings and priorities more deeply than I'd expected. Would I consider moving to Seattle for Elena? The possibility hadn't occurred to me before she mentioned the job offer. But as I thought about it, the idea wasn't unappealing. I'd consider it, I said. My work is portable, and there are probably as many opportunities for community-focused architecture in Seattle as there are in Portland. The question is whether you'd want me to consider it. Elena's expression softened, and for the first time since our relationship had begun, she looked at me with unguarded affection rather than careful consideration. Well, I'd want you to consider it, but only if it felt right for your own reasons, not just because of our relationship. What if both could be true? What if moving to Seattle would be good for my career and good for our relationship? Then maybe this job offer is an opportunity for both of us to take the next step, whatever that looks like. That evening marked a turning point in our relationship, transforming Elena's caution into active consideration of our future together. The Seattle job offer had created a deadline for decisions about our commitment to each other, forcing us to move beyond gradual exploration into more definitive territory. Over the following week, Elena and I had multiple conversations about the practical and emotional implications of her job offer. She researched Seattle's healthcare architecture scene and confirmed that there would be opportunities for collaboration between her new position and my consulting work. I investigated the city's approach to sustainable development and discovered architectural firms whose values aligned with my evolving professional focus. The more we discussed the possibility of relocating together, the more excited we both became about the adventure of building a life in a new city. Seattle offered professional opportunities that Portland couldn't match, while also providing a fresh start for a relationship that had begun during one of the most difficult periods of my life. Elena accepted the Seattle position with a start date 3 months away, giving us time to plan our respective relocations and prepare for the next phase of our relationship. The decision felt both terrifying and exhilarating, a commitment to each other that was based on shared goals, rather than just romantic attraction. 2 weeks after Elena accepted the Seattle position, Rebecca called to inform me that she and Marcus were engaged and planning a spring wedding. Her news felt like information from a different life, relevant to someone I used to be but not connected to who I was becoming. I wanted you to hear it from me rather than through mutual friends, Rebecca said, her tone suggesting that she expected me to have strong feelings about her engagement. Congratulations, I replied, meaning it sincerely. I hope you'll be very happy together. Thank you. That's generous of you to say. It's not generous, it's honest. You deserve to be with someone who makes you happy, and Marcus clearly does that. Rebecca was quiet for a moment, apparently processing my lack of bitterness or resentment about her upcoming marriage to the man she'd been involved with during our divorce. How are you doing, David? I heard you've been dating someone. Doing well? Better than I've been in years, actually. I was worried about how you'd handle everything, but you seem to have landed on your feet. The conversation with Rebecca was cordial but brief. Two people who had shared 8 years of life, but no longer had much to say to each other. Her engagement to Marcus felt like the final confirmation that our marriage had ended appropriately, freeing both of us to pursue relationships that better matched our respective needs and values. That same week, Elena and I had dinner with Dr. Moore to discuss the expansion of the community, its clinic, and the potential for developing a model that could be replicated in other underserved areas. The conversation evolved into planning for a healthcare architecture consultancy that Elena and I could establish together. Combining her expertise in patient care with my design skills, you two have developed something special, Dr. Moore observed, as we discussed our collaborative approach to healthcare design. The integration of medical knowledge and architectural expertise could really transform how we think about therapeutic environments. Elena and I exchanged glances that acknowledged both the professional opportunity and the personal relationship that made such collaboration possible. We were building something together that was larger than either of our individual capabilities, creating work that could genuinely improve people's lives while also supporting our own partnership. As Elena's departure date approached, I realized that my feelings for her had deepened beyond initial attraction into genuine love based on shared values. Mutual respect and compatibility that had been tested through various challenges. Was intelligent, compassionate, professionally accomplished, and personally committed to using her skills in service of others. More importantly, Alina saw me clearly, my strengths and limitations, my goals and fears, my potential for growth and contribution. She appreciated my work not because of its economic success, but because of its positive impact on communities. She understood my need for authentic connection rather than performed relationship. On Elena's last night in Portland, we had dinner at the restaurant where we'd shared our first date. Reflecting on how much had changed in the 3 months since, our relationship had transitioned from professional to personal. Alina would drive to Seattle the next morning to begin her new position, and I would follow 2 weeks later after completing projects that required my presence in Portland. "Are you nervous about tomorrow?" I asked as we shared dessert that reminded us of our first tentative steps toward romantic relationship. "Excited more than nervous," Elena replied. "This feels like the beginning of something important, both professionally and personally. I feel the same way. Like everything that happened this year, the heart attack, the divorce, meeting you, was preparation for whatever comes next." Elena reached across the table and took my hand. The first truly intimate gesture she'd made since our relationship had begun. "I love you, David. I wanted to say that before we start this new adventure together." "I love you too," I replied, feeling the words settle into place with the certainty of decisions that align perfectly with both heart and mind. Our relationship had begun during the most vulnerable period of my life, when I was recovering from surgery and processing the end of my marriage. Alina had provided professional care that restored my physical health while also helping me rediscover emotional authenticity and personal purpose. Now we were choosing to build a future together based on compatibility, shared values, and mutual support for each other's growth and goals. Lena's job offer had forced us to move beyond gradual exploration into committed partnership, proving that what we'd built during my recovery was strong enough to survive major life changes. The next morning, I watched Alina drive away from Portland toward her new life in Seattle, carrying with her my heart and my hope for our shared future. In 2 weeks, I would follow, closing the architectural practice I'd built over 15 years, and opening a new chapter focused on healthcare design and community service. Everything I'd learned during my recovery about authenticity, purpose, and the importance of relationships that supported rather than diminished personal growth would be tested as Alina and I built a life together in a new city. But I felt ready for whatever challenges awaited us, confident that we'd created a foundation strong enough to support whatever we chose to build together. 2 years after my heart surgery, I stood in the rehabilitation center we'd designed together. In downtown Seattle, watching Alina lead a training session for healthcare professionals from across the Pacific Northwest, the space embodied everything we'd learned about therapeutic environments: natural light streaming through carefully positioned windows, healing gardens visible from every patient area, and flexible spaces that could accommodate both individual recovery and community support. Alina moved through the training with the same confidence and compassion that had first attracted me during my own recovery. But now she was teaching other healthcare providers how to integrate environmental psychology with medical treatment. Her expertise had evolved beyond individual patient care to system-wide transformation of how hospitals and clinics approached healing. The consulting firm we'd established had exceeded our most optimistic projections. With projects throughout Washington, Oregon, and Northern California, healthcare facilities that implemented our evidence-based design principles reported improved patient outcomes, reduced recovery times, and higher staff satisfaction rates. We'd proven that thoughtful architecture could measurably enhance medical care. But professional success felt secondary to the personal happiness Alina and I had built together. Moving to Seattle had strengthened our relationship in ways that staying in comfortable familiarity never could have achieved. We'd learned to navigate challenges as partners, supporting each other through the stress of relocating, establishing new careers, and building a life together from scratch. Our wedding had taken place the previous spring in the rooftop garden of the hospital where Alina worked, surrounded by colleagues who'd become family and patients whose lives we'd helped improve through better design. The ceremony was small and focused on commitment rather than spectacle, reflecting our shared values about substance over appearance. Rebecca and Marcus had divorced 18 months after their wedding, their relationship apparently unable to survive the reality of daily life together. I learned about their separation through mutual acquaintances and felt only mild sympathy for the inevitable conclusion of a partnership built on excitement rather than compatibility. Rebecca had moved to San Francisco for a marketing position that promised the kind of adventure she'd been seeking. My own health had stabilized completely, with annual cardiac checkups showing excellent function and no signs of the disease that had nearly killed me. The lifestyle changes I'd made during recovery, better nutrition, regular exercise, stress management, and meaningful work had become permanent habits that supported long-term wellness. Alina and I had recently purchased a house in Seattle's Capitol Hill neighborhood, a 1920s craftsman that we were renovating using sustainable materials and universal design principles. The project combined our professional expertise with personal investment in creating a home that could adapt to our changing needs over time. Our relationship had deepened through shared challenges and mutual support in ways that felt fundamentally different from my marriage to Rebecca. Lena and I approached problems as collaborative, as puzzles to be solved together rather than individual burdens to be managed separately. We celebrated each other's successes without competition and provided comfort during difficulties without judgment. The conversation that had started during my cardiac rehabilitation about architecture as service had evolved into a practice that influenced healthcare design throughout the region. We developed a reputation for creating spaces that honored both medical functionality and human dignity, demonstrating that healing environments could be both beautiful and effective. Alina had been invited to speak at national conferences about patient-centered design, while I'd been featured in architectural magazines for innovative approaches to community health facilities. Our work was gaining recognition beyond the Pacific Northwest, with inquiries from healthcare systems in other regions interested in implementing our methodologies. But fame and professional recognition mattered less than the daily satisfaction of work that aligned with our values and supported our relationship rather than competing with it. We'd learned to integrate career ambitions with personal priorities in ways that strengthened both aspects of our lives. Standing in the rehabilitation center that evening, watching Alina teach other healthcare providers about therapeutic environments, I reflected on how dramatically my life had changed since the morning I'd entered the hospital for heart surgery. The man who'd been rushed to the operating room while his wife was with another man felt like a character from someone else's story. Recovery had taught me that crisis could be opportunity if approached with courage and openness to change. Nearly dying had shown me how much of my previous life had been slowly killing me through stress, compromise, and relationships that diminished rather than supported personal growth. Lena had been instrumental in my transformation, but not because she'd saved me from my circumstances. Instead, she'd helped me remember who I was beneath years of accumulated disappointment and compromise. Her care during my most vulnerable period had restored my faith in authentic connection and meaningful work. As Alina concluded her training session and colleagues began to leave the rehabilitation center, she joined me near the windows that overlooked Elliott Bay. The view reminded us daily of why we'd chosen Seattle as the place to build our life. Together, a city that valued innovation, environmental consciousness, and quality of life over purely economic considerations. "How did the session go?" I asked, putting my arm around Alina as we watched the sunset paint the water in shades of gold and pink. "Really well. There's so much enthusiasm for changing how we think about healthcare spaces. I think we're going to see some beautiful projects come out of today's training. You're changing how healthcare happens, one facility at a time." Lena smiled and leaned into my embrace. It's comfortable in ways that had developed through 2 years of partnership based on mutual respect and shared goals. We're changing it together. Your architectural expertise makes the vision possible. Looking out at the water where ferries carried commuters between Seattle and surrounding islands, I thought about journeys and destinations, about how the most important trips often led to places we hadn't known we wanted to reach. My heart attack had forced a journey I'd never planned, through divorce and recovery and career transformation, ultimately leading to this life with Alina that felt more authentic than anything I'd previously experienced. The rehabilitation center where we stood represented everything we'd learned about healing and hope. It's about second chances and the courage required to build something new from the ruins of what hadn't worked. Patients who entered the building, fearful and broken, left stronger and more confident, having discovered their own capacity for recovery and growth. Elena and I had become living examples of the principles we taught, that healing was possible, that change could be positive, that relationships built on genuine compatibility could thrive even through major life transitions. Our love story had begun during my darkest period and developed into partnership that supported both individual growth and shared achievements. As evening settled over Seattle and the rehabilitation center prepared to close for the night, Elena and I walked hand in hand through the spaces we'd designed together, past the healing gardens and comfortable recovery areas, through corridors that promoted hope rather than anxiety. We'd created something beautiful and functional, a place where other people could begin their own journeys toward health and happiness. The future stretched ahead of us, filled with possibilities. We were excited to explore together new projects that would further revolutionize healthcare design. It's a potential expansion of our consulting practice to national scope. Maybe starting a family in the house we were renovating with such care and intention. But for now, it was enough to stand together in the space we'd created, surrounded by evidence of our shared commitment to work that mattered and love that had proven strong enough to survive every test we'd encountered. My heart beat steadily, in my chest, strong and reliable, pumping blood through arteries that had been rebuilt to support whatever adventures awaited us. Elena's hand in mine felt like home, like safety, like the promise of partnership that would continue growing stronger. Through whatever challenges or opportunities the future might bring, we'd learned that love could heal more than hearts, that meaningful work could transform communities, and that second chances were worth the courage required to embrace them completely. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.